I'll begin the second half of week 5 in RELS 100 with a reading from a writing of the Ketuvim, this famous part of the Hebrew Bible. These are the book of Psalms, and this is a psalm that's many probably, if you know, makes its way even into movies, particularly in scenes of funerals. But really, it's a psalm that expresses the depth of the devotional life of Judaism. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We come then to this section of the Hebrew Bible, the section of Jewish history, which creates what is known as Second Temple Judaism. From 1515 before the Common Era to 70 of the Common Era, or 1515 BC to 70 AD. So in 538 before the Common Era, the Persian king Cyrus, referred to in Isaiah chapter 45 as the anointed or Messiah, this Persian non-Jewish king returns Israel from captivity back into their homeland. In 515, the second temple is rebuilt. And so you see an image of the second temple, which defines this period of Jewish history, appropriately enough called Second Temple Judaism. In 331 begins the Hellenistic period with Alexander the Great's conquest, and this starts a movement away from Hebrew as the common language to Greek. So if you know first century of the Common Era, perhaps the New Testament is written in Greek. Why would Jewish people be speaking Greek? It's because of Alexander in 331 having this conquest over the Levant, or the area we know as Israel or Palestine. This is interesting also. In the 3rd century BC, the 200s BCE, there was a translation of the Hebrew Bible made into Greek called the Septuagint, because Hebrew was being lost. People said we still need to have the sacred text, so we're going to translate into the Greek. The story is that 70 translators who knew Greek, could study the Hebrew Bible, got together. They produced their own individual translations, and ultimately every translation was the same, and that is the 70 of the Septuagint, indicated by LXX, which means 70 in Greek, and just one more sign of the power of the Greek language over the people of Israel. And also, what is the Bible that we're now coming into a period that Jesus comes into, the period of the Second Temple, the period of Hellenization, it's called. And the Bible that would have been known by the first century of the Common Era Jews, including early Christians, the early Christian movement, was the Septuagint. All right, that was a long excursus. Let's go then to December of 167 before the Common Era. And I want to read to you about one of the, what shall we say, one of the most narcissistic kings of all time, who had an idea of self-importance, the Seleucid king of the Syrian Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes means Antiochus, God present. The God is present through me. Can you imagine that? Meeting somebody like that? Okay, so let's just hear how the Oxford Companion to the Bible describes this person. Antiochus made many political errors and had one further disastrous political error in 167 before the Common Era to, quote, compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and no longer to live by the laws of God, also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call on the temple of Olympian Zeus. End of quote. This is from 2 Maccabees 6, verses 1 through 2. This is what Antiochus Epiphanes did. And we mentioned that the books of the Maccabees are a few of the books that are contained in the Deuterocanonical literature, the second sacred literature of which the Catholic Bible has and the Protestant Bible doesn't. All right. According to 1 Maccabees 1, chapter 1, verses 41 through 50, the king decreed the Jews to, quote, follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the sanctuary of the temple, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile their sanctuary and their priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. End of quote. And this was followed in December 167 by the erection of, quote, a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of burnt offering, end of quote. 1 Maccabees 1, verse 54. That is, the erection of altars throughout Judah and the proscription, that is the making illegal of the Jewish law. So many things are being done against the Jews. People were being killed for practicing Sabbath. They were killed if they wouldn't eat pork. They were killed if they resisted this polytheistic desecration of their temple. These descriptions show that in Jewish eyes, the king was persecuting Jewish religion by attacking the law and the temple. The result then was a rebellion led by Judas called Maccabeus, the hammer-like, in 1 Maccabees 2:4. The rebellion is described in detail in 1 Maccabees and cannot be recounted in full. In outline, however, it developed this way. After several local victories in Judah, Judas Maccabeus occupied the temple area, purged it of non-Jewish cultic activities, worship activities, and rededicated it in December of 164 before the Common Era. This was the institution of the festival of Hanukkah, called the Feast of Dedication, in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 22. So you can see this history and why when people looked to glorious resistance to this ongoing assault of oppressors, this was a golden era. All right, we're going to look at what happens during the Second Temple. You see an inscription in the Arch of Titus, where this is in Rome, in the Forum, describing what happens and what Josephus, the Jewish writer, describes in his Wars in the 7th chapter. Zealot leaders were captured by Titus in Jerusalem in 70 AD CE and were paraded in Rome in the procession depicted on the Arch of Titus. Again, you'll see that in ancient Rome today. That's a little bas relief from that. Here's what Malloy writes in Experiencing the World's Religions. And I think this is important to see the shift I mentioned from the time in which there was the temple and the Messianic king and the ruling over the land and the Jews to the Second Temple period, which even though there was a temple, it was never quite as grand as the First Temple, and there were some elements missing. A major change happens with the destruction of the Second Temple, and that came in 70 of the Common Era. So the Second Temple itself gets destroyed, which brought about the end of Second Temple-based ceremonial religion of that region and a widespread dispersion of its people to lands far away from Israel. So not only do you have Second Temple Judaism, you have the end of it, and we're going to come back to this in a moment, in another week and look at this. But for now, just take that in. You have a bracketing from 515 before the Common Era to 70 of the Common Era. All right, during this period, there's an incredible emergence of what's called apocalyptic thought. During times of persecution, apocalyptic thought flourishes. In a book I use for another class, The End of the World, RELS 357, I use a book called When Time Shall Be No More by Paul Boyer. And he talks about apocalyptic thought in the United States and how it's rooted in this apocalyptic thought from the Hebrew Bible and from the New Testament as well. Here's what Boyer writes. What then is an apocalypse? The word itself is Greek, meaning an unveiling of that which is hidden. The biblical scholar John Collins offers a useful definition. Quote, a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. End of quote. Collins further distinguishes two major types of apocalypse, the historical, alluding to actual events past or future, and the otherworldly journey set forward in supernatural extraterrestrial realm. So there are definitely apocalypses in the Bible, parts of Daniel, in the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation, in books of the Second Temple period, especially after Israel was destroyed by the Babylonians. These successive oppressors came in. There's the book of Ezra, of Enoch, of Baruch, of Abraham, of Daniel, etc. So there's this whole period of an unveiling of literature. It's an unveiling of divine secrets. It usually describes two worlds and ages in conflict through veiled symbols. So these are symbols that anybody who was in Israel, in this case, would have known, but the oppressors wouldn't have known. So let me see if I can give you an analogy. If I said to you, Naomi beat Venus, but it didn't look like it was going to happen, she couldn't hold serve, but then she broke back and broke back against Venus's serve, but in the first set, won in the breaker 7-5. If you were a tennis player, you might know I was talking about women's tennis champions. You might know about tiebreakers and breaking serve, that people are usually expected to win on their serve, etc., etc. But if you didn't know the coded language, you wouldn't understand what I was talking about. This is what's happening in apocalyptic literature. In apocalyptic thought, there's some key passages. One is the 7th chapter in the Ketuvim, in the writings, the book of Daniel, which describes these 4 successive kingdoms, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. And finally, the Son of Man who comes to establish an everlasting kingdom. Here it is, Daniel 7, chapter 7, that is, verses 13. As I watched in the night vision, I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Okay, so this is the language of people who are under oppression, using apocalyptic literature and revelation to describe what God is doing in another world behind the world that we see. This is obviously extremely important as we come to the Christian movement, which we'll come to soon. But for now, it's a key part of the Jewish movement of the time, because the Jews were saying, how could we still believe in a good God that controls history? Well, right now, things aren't going as we planned. The temple was destroyed. It's being rebuilt. But we're still under the oppression of Rome. We're still in exile in a way, even if we have our temple back. There's no messianic king, even with this brief flash of Judas Maccabeus. But what's going on is behind the scenes, God's doing something. At the end of the day, God's army will win, and the oppressor will be kicked out. Some final comments on the Ketuvim. There are 13 books in this third ring of the Hebrew Bible. after the Torah and the prophets. These books I read from earlier, the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and what we would call an historical book, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Reading from the Jewish Study Bible, here's how they introduce this section. The vague term Ketuvim, or writing, reflects the variety of material collected in this canonical division, ranging from historical works, for example, the Chronicles, prayers, Psalms, wisdom works, for example, Job, and apocalyptic prophecy, the second half of Daniel. It is likely that the various books now in this section entered the canon for quite different reasons. Psalms was used for prayers. The Song of Songs was probably first canonized as an ancient erotic poem used in wedding ceremonies, while the books of Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes may have been placed together in the canon because all three belong to a category of writing known as wisdom literature. Most likely the books now in Ketuvim came together and were viewed as authoritative and ultimately canonized toward the end of the Second Temple period. So this third piece of the Hebrew canon was put together probably around the time of Jesus, or probably just after Jesus. And here's why I say that. When Jesus refers to the books of the Jewish sacred scriptures, he talks about the law and the prophets. He doesn't mention the writings. So the Ketuvim came together in the end of the Second Temple. Again, that would be 70 of the Common Era. After the canonical section, Nevi'im, or prophets, was closed, and thus the books now composing Ketuvim were assembled together into a single group. So it's the final form after the Jewish exile. So we're seeing, this is another point, we're seeing a lot of these books may have had earlier points, like the book of Psalms probably had some earlier Psalms before the exile, but the form is post-exilic, after the exile, or exilic, either way. As I said, some believe that this may not be finalized into the 1st or maybe even the 2nd century. Interestingly, 2 books bear women's names, Ruth and why am I not finding the other one? Esther, yes. Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah are what we would call history, and as I mentioned, Daniel has both historical and prophetic elements to him. So this closes out these 3 sections, as I mentioned: Torah, first 5 books, the prophets, and the writings. The final centuries of the Second Temple. In 63, the Roman rule begins, closing out. This is the last part of this progression of oppressors. This is what is in place. Pompey, the Roman ruler, enters Jerusalem. He goes into the Holy of Holies, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was said to be held, desecrates it just like Judas, not like Judas Maccabeus, just like Antiochus Epiphanes does. In 20 before the Common Era, Herod the Great, the sort of Jewish but also quite Roman emperor, rebuilds the temple. This would be the temple. It's a reconstruction of the Second Temple. This would be the temple, of course, of the 1st century that Jesus was walking around in, was completed in 64. In 66 to 70, there's a Jewish rebellion against Rome, which results in the destruction of the temple. So the Second Temple is destroyed. This is where the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, is today, the retaining wall of the Second Temple. This picture I have is of a scale replica in Jerusalem of the Second Temple. And you can see there's the courtyards and other places, the wall, and the temple itself, which would have been where the Holy of Holies is, the center of that picture. And then finally, in 132 to 135, a second rebellion under Simeon ben Kosaba, who believed that a new era had dawned, a new age had dawned. He made coins with one of his new era, but his rebellion is ultimately crushed. Jerusalem is ultimately destroyed. It becomes a Roman city with no Jewish name. All Jews are dispersed, and rabbinic Judaism flourishes under what's called the dispersion or the diaspora. More on that next time.